And I always say change is positive if you're on the good side of change. Everybody says, oh, I love change. What they mean by that is, I've been always on the good side. So when change has happened, I've come out ahead. If you're on the part of change where your job no longer exists when this change is finished, you're probably not going to sort of be that enthusiastic about it.
Today's guest is Bill Bryant. He spent 40 years leading corporate teams across 8 countries and 6 industries when a significant corporate restructure became the catalyst for his own professional pivot. He chose to leverage the lifequake to help other leaders develop transitional intelligence. We're diving into how to turn organizational disruption into your most powerful competitive edge. Let's dive in. You became a coach to help people, but no one told you how to build the business behind it. Welcome to Coach as Entrepreneur, the show for coaches building real businesses with systems, strategy, and heart. Build the system, serve your clients, and support your family. Bill, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, David, it's good to see you again.
I'm excited to talk with you. You've got a ton of experience. You've been around a lot of the world, working in a lot of different industries. And so there's a lot I'd like to cover about your experiences and where you see the world shifting. But before we get into that, I'd love to know about you and how you found out about coaching.
Hey, that's a good question because I'm often asked, given that my background is in fact in chemical engineering, which is not a straight line to coaching. But what I found was that over many years, in fact, from probably the early 2000s, I took on and really enjoyed and excelled at doing mentoring of a quite wide range of colleagues, some of whom I even followed as they went to other organizations or I went to other organizations. And so that built this feeling that this was perhaps a skill set that I could leverage and enjoy. And then as I looked to what do I do beyond my formal corporate career, you explore a lot of different things and everyone comes up with, oh, maybe I could do consulting or whatever. And there was a little bit of that. But I thought what would be interesting for me and easy to fit into a lifestyle where you are now post-corporate, let's say that. And it was actually a completely serendipitous meeting whilst doing a boating license of all things in Singapore, where I met a chap on a boat and he and I got chatting. And through the discussion, he made the following comment. He said, you should speak to my partner. He runs a coaching business and I think you have got all the right styles for coaching. And I thought, all right, well, okay. I mean, I hadn't quite seen that one coming. And so one thing led to the next. It turns out that they were both cyclists. I was a cyclist. We did cycling together, got on famously. And, he said, look, I'll give you a decent rate to get yourself started on the coursework. I did, and it just felt very natural. So that's sort of how I got into the formal side of coaching. But when I reflect back on my life, I realized that actually a large part of my job involved coaching and mentoring people all through. And in fact, it was the thing that was reflected on most as I did my farewell and exit tour. Most of the leaders and most of the people I worked with reflected on the thing they're going to miss, the guidance, mentorship, coaching, and encouragement that I used to give, which obviously wasn't formally my job description, but it turned out it was a very natural thing for me. So it's been a sort of progression and then formalizing it with qualifications. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I do see that a lot where leaders in organizations, because it kind of falls under, not necessarily in the description, but it kind of falls under the role and responsibilities of that level of, your position in the organization. If you're a leader, you have to lead, and to lead people, you have to sometimes mentor people. Sometimes you got to coach people. You just got to, but you're the leader. So you have to have some of these skills, right?
Absolutely, David. I think what you see across organizations, and as you mentioned, I've worked in a variety of industries and organizations, and this cuts across cultural bases. The thing that people crave most but get the least of is useful and let's call it directive, or let's call it helpful feedback. But that's in essence what coaching seeks to do, not through prescribing and directing, but encouraging that information to come out. And if you look at what's most sought in today, especially in Asia, you see a lot of coaching programs. What they're selling is the leader as coach. And that highlights that need and that desire that people even lead consciously in a coaching methodology. So I think it sort of, you're right. I mean, it becomes an important part of the equation, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's necessarily good at that. But in the role that I played, in a regional role, covering a lot of people who are often far away from the center, that becomes an important role and people really seek it out. So it was
Yeah.
something I gravitated towards quite naturally.
Yeah. I think if you're natural at it, then that's great because, you don't have to really work too hard at it. But there's a lot of people who, especially first-time managers, when you become a first-time manager, there's a lot of, it's not the same as being like just the subject matter expert. Like you're going from working, doing the work to now overseeing the work and managing the people doing the work. And so it's a whole different skill set.
And David, I think that, you're touching on such an important point because what I'm seeing and where I'm sort of gradually moving towards and seeing as the clear area where I'd like to operate is exactly in those emerging leader groups, because
Mm,
coaching traditionally is seen as an executive suite type leadership development
yeah.
tool. And in fact, some organizations have formally said that below the executive suite, you're not getting human coaching, you'll get AI coaching or general training. And that's fine. I mean, each
Yeah.
organization runs it their way. And traditionally, certainly, coaching has had a real fit at that executive level. But the thing I see is that people emerging are the ones that are, in fact, struggling the most and for whom the methodology
Mhm.
of coaching probably, in fact, has even more value than at the executive level because they are at that stage where they don't know what they don't know, but they can see things that, hang on, this doesn't make any sense to me. And then they're trying to find a way to translate that. So
Yeah.
coaching and perhaps with a dose of mentoring here and there becomes so valuable. I mean, I've seen it. My two most recent clients fit squarely in that category. And you could see sometimes how they would just be thinking, how do you know this? And I said, well, look, I had 40 years of this. So I have actually seen this from both sides. And they said, yeah, because we've
Yeah.
always wondered. We couldn't figure out why. We couldn't think what was driving that. What was the meaning of that? And so you're 100% right. And I think I see that a lot in the coaching space, that the people that really are articulating the need is that, and that speaks to the point you were just making very well, that in a normal environment, you would get that from your leader, but it's not natural for all leaders. And it speaks to the point I was making, which is that what's this in demand course or training? Coaching leaders to
Yeah.
be coaches. And because organizations are also seeing,
Yeah.
if we can, we need to try and expand the set of people who have, if not natural skills, but they've learned some of the techniques.
Yeah. And actually, why I like this subject so much is because for me, I spent most of my career in the coaching industry by accident. I never intended to, but I got in there and then I stayed. And then I went from being a subject matter expert doing actually like multimedia filming and then building online courses and technology for the coaching organization. And then I became a manager. And I knew for me, because of what I was watching and seeing in terms of how to coach people during certification programs, I knew that there's going to be a gap. And so when I became a manager within that organization, I said, okay, great. I'd love to be a manager. I love to help and I love where we're going, but I need a coach because there's a gap here. Like I know how to do the work. I can probably manage people okay, but I really want to be successful. And how do I become successful? Well, I need somebody who can help me be that. Like I could figure it out, but do you really want me to spend years figuring it out or like just help me accelerate? Just coach me.
And it is about, from an organizational point of view, the benefit is that in fact you enhance the performance of somebody. So there is, I think there's always a debate about coaching, but I think it's clear that done for the right people at the right time, there is almost inevitably a very clear payback in terms of
Yeah.
enhanced and improved performance, and also just opening up a person to some of their own blind spots, which often don't matter or don't matter as much at the subject matter level expert or at the doing level,
Mhm.
but at the leading level become sometimes real stumbling blocks because now it's not affecting only
Yeah.
what they do, but affecting the work of a lot of other people and sometimes the dynamic of a team. So it has a multiplier effect. So there's real value there.
I would also say that there's probably an outsized impact when you're working with high potentials or emerging leaders because they're closer to the work. They're just closer to it versus your C-suite, right? And so, because when you're at your C-suite level, you kind of get the dashboard of the KPIs, but then you're not necessarily with the teams who are doing the work all the time, day to day. And with those emerging leaders, they are. And so, I mean, I'm just interested, like, what do you think? Like, what do you see, like, from those emerging leaders if you're training them and teaching them and coaching them?
I think it's a confluence of three things. It's a very interesting point you raise because I'd say what I'm starting to see, and I see that there is literature on this, is that one of the biggest determinants of whether a coaching engagement will be successful is the readiness of the person to be coached. So if they're
Yeah.
aware, as you were, that, look, I need help because I can feel this gap, or the gentleman that I've been coaching in the Middle East, where the organization said, we know and recognize that this guy's being
Yeah.
lifted up out of a very task-oriented role, but he's got a lot of the potential, and we'd like to
Mm.
speak to him about coaching. And he then became very receptive to that, because all the anxiety that came up in him was due to his realization that, oh, I'd like the job. Actually, no, now I'm not too sure whether I know what to do. And
Mhm.
his readiness it's been amazing to watch, because he's had that tremendous self-awareness, willingness to do the work, willingness to go away and make the changes. You can see that that's one big
Mm.
determinant. So that's the one point about that. And oftentimes people in very high positions don't necessarily have that readiness to be coached, because part of why you're at a senior level is because you're sort of kind of the guru. So don't necessarily feel like, what am I going to learn from this guy coming in from outside? Whereas that other person really senses the need. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, I think you're
Yeah.
right in that oftentimes I talk of change within organizations as needing a sort of vision, which, if you like, the leader or the leadership team provides. Like, okay, this is why we want to do something, and this is where we want to go. Then you need tools
Mhm.
and techniques, and that's oftentimes where consultants get involved. They bring a bag of
Yeah.
tricks and tools and what have you. They're not necessarily, but then
Yeah.
you need a critical mass of change, and that usually is at the level 2, level 3. And that can be absolutely instrumental. Even if the other two are good, it can fail at that level, to the exact point you're making, because at some point you have to do actual work that actually needs to change in the way people do actual day-to-day work. And we can talk a new leadership
Yeah.
style, but if we can't actually effect the change at the working level, oftentimes nothing fundamentally changes, because change is not a generic concept. It's about structurally, mechanically, if you like, changing what we do. That usually happens
Mhm.
at the working level. And then there's another jump down to the very bottom, where you need to manage the change for the person, because they are largely in adaptation. They will be told, here's the new set of
Mm.
rules, and then they will accept. But the people you have to influence, persuade, guide, and bring along with you are that level 2, level 3. So that's the second part of it. And then the third part of where that fits together is that it's the individual who's now in this new position, who's trying to now simultaneously break away from the doing and do the leading, but he's not got enough tools here, and he's trying to help out there, and he can sort of see the vision, but he
Yeah.
needs to communicate to the top. But that's all a new language for him. So that's the third part that's going on. So that's why
Yeah.
coaching can provide a lot of power at
Yeah.
that level, because it's actually hitting on much more than the apparent thing it's speaking to.
Yeah, exactly. It's a hard role to be in because you're literally in the middle, right, of the work and between the different levels. And you're trying to, depending on where your organization is, implement change or just learning to communicate as somebody in the middle in between. And it's a new role. So it's lots of things are changing and in flux. Before we started recording, we started talking a little bit about AI
Yes.
and how AI is starting to change things. And there's a ton of research, data at least, of because right now, the way I see AI being implemented in the world, we are all in a giant sandbox being testing AI as it's coming out. And no one really knows because it's a giant experiment. We're all testing and trying and figuring this out. The whole thing with change, like when I was younger in university, I used to work at a bank and I was a bank teller. And I was there during a time when they switched out the software. Not even switching out the software, it was a software upgrade, right? So it's not like a new software, it's just a software upgrade, but some of the UI changed. The people who were there longer had a harder time with the transition of the UI change because some of the buttons moved, some of the way the functionality changed. It was all intended to be better, but for people who had gotten used to using the system, it was very difficult. And so what I see in that is that it's hard for people, learn and to change and adapt. And when I look at AI coming into the business and I look at what happened the last year in 2025, a lot of companies said, AI, great. We got to jump on this bandwagon. Let's apply this into our business. Everybody, here you go. Here's AI. Good luck.
Yeah, look, there's context around this, because I'm old enough to have lived through the dot-com era and seen the before and the after. And as we know, with the dot-com era, there was fundamental change to how we worked. To give an idea, when I started my export management job, everything was on faxes, which was already then the new, like, amazing thing to be able to do. But I would arrive at a hotel in Brazil and I'd get a pack of 20 faxes that had come through with all the daily orders that I'd sign and write on, and then I'd fax them back. And that was considered sophisticated. And then all of a sudden we roll on 2-3 years. And at that time, there was only really one guy in our entire department who had a computer. And he was like, oh, he's got the computer, and captured the sales stats and what have you. But then within 2-3 years, everybody had a computer. Then just a year or two on, we're traveling with modems, and then not very long after that, it's Wi-Fi. And so that dot-com era did have fundamental change. However, one cannot forget that there were also a huge number of, or a massive amount of waste, let's put it that way, a lot of misdirected spending, which was aimed around just the hype, saying, look, if I throw something at the wall, maybe it'll come off. And as we know, there were a lot of companies that were formed with the sole purpose of being sold, that had, they were, let's say, in dog training, and it became dogtraining.com. And then apparently it was a company, and WeWorks is probably the best example of a fundamentally ordinary business model, but because it had an app, it was now suddenly an amazing technical innovation. But the point about that is that that's probably not dissimilar to AI. And I've heard a lot of talk around, there's a bubble forming, but what people are speculating on is, are we at the start of the bubble, and the bubble's, the burst is coming. Everybody agrees that it's coming, but is it 1 year away? Is it 2 years away? Is it 3 years away? And what will trigger that? Because the investment in AI is way ahead of where businesses are adopting. And that's the thing to look at, because that was what businesses were struggling with then. I worked in a chemical business at the time, and they thought, well, we've got to move our sales online. It was okay, but what does that mean? I mean, that's not how people that we deal with buy that kind of product. So are we just going online because we have to be online, or we feel we have to? And then there was that realization of, okay, maybe we need to solve the right problem. And so I get the sense when I talk to organizations today, and even if I look within the coaching industry, AI is helping, certainly, but the value of the use cases is not matching the hype. If you listen to Sam Altman and Elon Musk and what have you, where AI will run the world, and then there'll be a couple of us, I guess, on the side feeding the power stations that feed the energy that drive the data centers. It's just not matching. And even the organization I worked for, there was a lot of excellent pilot work being done, but the ability to widespread roll it out, where it fundamentally changed jobs, that wasn't as obvious. But where it's having a lot of help is in predictive models, any models that try to anticipate pricing, demand, that sort of thing. It's starting to help. Not perfect, but it's starting to help. And so that's where it's having value. I mean, we all interact with it. I mean, almost everybody that goes on a website today gets spoken to by a chatbot. But if you look at those chatbots, if you ask anything other than a straightforward question, it says, no, sorry, you've got the wrong person. I don't know how to answer that question.
Or it'll make something up, something very just out of this world.
But I mean, I deal with a local telecommunications provider. And if you go on there, if you ask them questions like account, then it'll say, what do you want to do with your account? And if you say question billing, it'll tell you an answer. But if you write in the question, I'm having a problem with my account because there seems to be differences on the billing, it'll say, I do not understand this. But you've actually asked the same question. So they're not very sophisticated, is my point. But they are being deployed everywhere.
I see.
So
I think
it is wide, but it's not dissimilar to the dot-com in that way, because in the dot-com, everybody sort of had suddenly a dot-com. But if you say, okay, but what is its fundamental purpose? How is it fundamentally changing your business? I don't know. But anyway, we've got to have one because, the guy next door's got one. So we've also got one.
it's the FOMO. It's the fear of missing out, right? And
but
it makes sense.
It has value. The thing I think is important, and that's what I think the pilots that the former company was doing was very informative. If you do AI at the simple level, where it's essentially enhanced Google, I mean, it surprises you with some of the answers it can give, because you can ask it, tell me a great route planning for a drive up the west coast of Australia, and it'll come up with great ideas. But that's because that's known and available information that it can just package easily for you. So you're impressed by the fact that it can package it for you. But if you go and look at it, you think, look, I could have probably done that research in a day and probably come up with the same answer anyway. So it's not really like it's giving you something inspiring. However, if you do really advanced AI, where you have people that really understand how to interrogate the model, how to force the questioning, you start to tremendously improve what comes back at you. But it's
Yeah.
always, I'm always reminded of, this takes me all the way back to at university where a professor said to us that just because it's printed on computer paper does not mean the answer is right. You still have to go and check, hey, does this make sense? So it
Yes.
needs a sanity check at the end of the day.
Of course. I think in the whole experience of this, to me, one thing is like, are the companies using AI or like rolling out this AI technology? And I think that's what you're referring to, that bubble, right? In terms of like, these businesses are getting overhyped because they're saying it's going to solve all of this stuff. But in reality, when people are actually using it and applying it, what is it actually doing for us? Like, and I don't know all of the numbers, but like something like OpenAI, like ChatGPT, had a ton of investment, but they're burning cash on a monthly basis. Like, just
That's the signal for the start or the elements that make up a bubble, because that's no different than the .com. What you started
yeah,
to see was that companies that had no benefit by going into an online model were just put into an online format. So, and I use silly examples, they're not real, but it would be as silly as saying I have a dog washing business and then I just call it dogwashing.com, and then I claim that I'm an internet-based business. And you think, well, no, you wash dogs. Maybe your
yeah,
booking system is online, but in those early days, people they literally had to just put .com in their name, and it
yeah.
was when the wrong things got connected. But that's not different than any other industry. For example, there was a biofuels boom back in the 2000s, and I remember a guy making a statement which so made the point we're trying to make here, which is he said, when so this was the guy that sold licenses that made the technology which allowed the bioesters to be made, which formed the basis of biofuel. And he
Mhm.
said, I can see that there is something wrong because there is now a Polish supermarket that's bought a license to build one of these plants. He said, that doesn't sound right. That's a bit like the analogous to the 1930s depression when Oppenheimer or Rockefeller, whomever it was, made the realization that something was wrong when the shoe shine guy outside the stock exchange said, "Oh yeah, he's bought a ton of shares," and he thought, "Hang on, that's not right. That this is getting crazy. That's irrational." When people that have no
Yeah,
understanding of how the thing works are diving into the business, and that was the same thing.
yeah,
That people that had a reason, chemical business that had a reason and a logic, they had feedstock, and they could have a reason to build these plants. That made sense, and he was saying,
mhm,
but when, of course, as a license seller, he was happy to sell the license, but he himself acknowledged. He said, "Look, this is going to go off the rails." And sure enough, a couple of years later, the whole thing kind of hit the wall because there was way too
mm,
much supply and too little demand. And
mm,
like every bubble, it burst for a while. And then everything
yeah,
rationalizes and you get the waste trimmed out of the system. But the main point to take away is that just like with .com, as it will be with AI, out of it will come the stuff that's actually useful, but it'll be a much
yeah,
reduced version of the hyped up can solve everything problem approach
yeah.
that's being stated as being what's possible.
Yeah. I think for me I try to be really practical in a day-to-day, like how do you use the tool in your life, right? To me, AI it's a tool, right? It's like a hammer. Like if you gave somebody who's never seen a hammer and you ask them what would you do with this, they might just, if you showed them a nail, they might think, "Oh, I hit the nail with it." They might put the nail in the hammer. I don't know, right? Or they might, if you say you hit the nail with the hammer, they could use a handle, the side of it. It's inoptimal, right? And so I think that's how we're interfacing and using AI a lot of the time right now. And I think so. My thing, or that what I was trying to come up to was within the organizations of leadership and development, and how are you using and applying AI? I think there's a lot of possibilities, but we just don't know how to use it. Companies and how they're building their businesses, that's one thing. And I totally agree that there's a bubble coming. But
Absolutely.
in the practical, like day to day of your leaders, are they using AI? Do they fear AI or just a pain in the butt because they're forcing it on them and they're like, this doesn't actually help me?
Yeah, well, I actually heard some really interesting interviews just within the last week that were of some very senior Japanese leaders that were present at Davos, and they were asked this question, and I really enjoyed their answer
Mm,
because they said three things. They said, "Look, it's a potential value adding tool that we have to then still figure out how to use and understand what the
mhm,
value case is," which is essentially what we're saying. So when you put it into the coaching world, you'd say, well, that's speaking to a management challenge problem. How do I deal with that? second part that they
Hmm.
said was, which I thought was the really interesting insight, I've not heard somebody say this before. Their comment was, what they're struggling with as leaders is to say, what does that tell us about the skill set that we should be hiring for? What are we supposed to develop into the
Mm.
future? And I thought that was really insightful, then, particularly hearing that then from a coaching angle. And then the third part
Hmm.
that they spoke of is that, look, we need to use the tool as best we can, not do nothing, but also
Yeah.
not sort of try and do everything. And so they're trying to find that
Yeah.
middle ground. And I think it speaks to, at least prior to this, what I've seen this done, or the way I would put this is a lot of people doing it in sort of pilot teams, lab teams who are sort of taking something, really trying to explore the use case and seeing almost if they
Yeah.
can generate a really valuable use case, but not
Yeah.
trying to already throw it into the business.
Yeah.
I like what they said, because for me, I reflected it back to where we're talking, which is saying, when all of this is said and done, do we see this in the coaching world? And I say yes, because it's the disruption again. It's anything that's disruptive
Hmm.
and could potentially change the nature of your business. Yeah, that's the
Hmm.
stuff that, as they say, should be or must be keeping leaders awake at night, because they're thinking, man, if I get this wrong, I could really look
Yeah.
stupid a couple of years from now. But if I get it right, of course, I would look like an
Mm.
absolute hero. But it costs money,
Yeah.
and therefore, if you like the simplified version of this, but potentially complicated version, is ERP systems. So I've seen a couple of
Hmm.
companies where ERP integrations and implementations have gone wrong, and then the whole business
Hmm.
grinds to a halt. So you've got this tool that you're bringing into the system that is going to solve everything, make everything fantastic, but implemented wrong and there's a very large company in America, which I'm aware of, where it actually simply stopped being able to do business. They couldn't process orders, they couldn't procure, and literally the business shut down. They were all hands on deck. And even a company I worked for many years ago, they discovered that somewhere the cash flow was not coming through this one division. And then they realized what would happen was they hadn't managed the change management, which brings it again back to our earlier conversation of coaching those leaders. And these folks just said, well, I'm just not going to enter this data because I haven't got the time. So they want me to do all these extra data entry points. Forget it. So they just left it. And then they stopped processing invoices. And then they had enough time to do their work. So they were moving stuff around, but nobody was getting billed. And then the company said, hang on, there's like a couple of million missing here. And then it all became true. But it all, again, what I like to try and do is, these are all good examples, but if you say, okay, but we're speaking from the coaching perspective, it's about two things. One is that group of people who
Mm.
manage between the leading and the doing. Why is that good for coaching? This is, again, another example to
Yeah.
try and help this person simultaneously deal with the do and the lead and trying to portray that correctly in the organization. And the second is anything that causes disruption to your daily way of working or changes the way that you work has much bigger consequences. And it always manifests at the human level ultimately, because you've got to bring people along.
Mm.
And I always say change is positive if you're on the good side of change. Everybody says, oh, I love change.
Mm.
What they mean by that is, I've been always on the good side. So when change has happened, I've come out ahead. If you're on the part of change where your job no longer exists when this change is finished, you're probably not going to sort of be that enthusiastic about it. And I think this again
Yeah.
circulates back on what we're talking, which is that's one of AI's big challenges. That the talk is that
Mm.
all jobs, or most or many jobs, are going to be eliminated. So imagine you're now asked to join in a project to roll out AI, and you think,
Mm.
I don't think so, because why would I help this thing to eliminate me? So that's what companies are dealing with. That's what leaders are dealing with. That's what ultimately this whole thing is, just a massive change management exercise.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the funny thing is, I just before we got on this call, I saw a headline that says like a lot of the tech companies are starting to regret letting go a lot of their developers. And that's where it just stopped. That was the headline, right? Because it's got to hook you in and you create that curiosity that so you want to read the rest. But the AI tools aren't perfect. They're still figuring it out. Let me bring us back into the transition of your work and your life, because the whole world is trying to figure this one thing out. How did you go about figuring out for your transition from your corporate life into the coaching life? Somebody said you would look good as a coach. You have all the skills for that. How did you rectify for yourself your identity from being a corporate leader to now becoming a coach? What was that transition for you like?
Actually, I would say it's been smooth and disruptive. So, the smooth part is that I found, just personally, that I have not struggled with what many people talk about the loss of identity and one of the big challenges as you move into post-corporate world. But certainly what I have struggled with is the loss of structure. And you don't
Mm,
realize the extent to which structure becomes so normal in your life because you do it for 40 years. And the way I put it is that often wasn't just Monday to Friday, but let's say Monday to Friday, 9 to 6 is spoken for. And you never have to think about that. You get up and when you're planning anything else in your week, you're thinking, okay, I want to go for a ride. I better do that in the morning. Or I need to go to the gym. Okay, I better do that in the evening. Or I need to catch up with that person. Or that'll have to be on Saturday. Because you don't even
mm,
think about these hours because they're spoken for. And then you step
right.
into this realm, and it's very pertinent to the world of coaching because you've got to develop your coaching business. So it starts essentially on zero, and suddenly you have no structure. And that struggle with suddenly Monday to Friday, 9 to 6 is empty. So that is the thing that really plagued me. And I found it caused me to almost come to a halt. And I had to really work at it. And I was able to then finally be directed towards a very good coach accelerator or coach business development program that's run by a lady out
Mm,
of Perth. And that has helped because what she does is exactly to try and bring back structure and say, all right, let's break this into some tasks, let's work on certain things. And then as you do that, you start getting structure. But it's not easy because your whole
yeah.
life's not structured. So you sort of think, okay, this is going to be easy. I'll just tackle this just like a normal day job and get to my desk at 9 and work through. But when there's
Yeah.
nothing that sort of forces that structure, it's pretty hard. So I'd say that's been the biggest adjustment, David, by far. And it's
Yeah.
tied in with the secondary thing, which is the developing of the business is a much harder challenge than the doing of the coaching.
You didn't become a coach to be a marketer. But if you want to build a sustainable business, you need a system that works for you while you're coaching. Coach Ops is designed to help you go from unpredictable referrals to a reliable marketing system without it feeling pushy or salesy. If you're ready to build something systematic, visit kyber5.com/coach ops. And that's the pattern that I see in a lot of the coaches I've spoken with is that when they've gone from corporate to coaching, highly intelligent people, right? Very giving, want to coach. But the problem is most people who get into coaching just want to coach. But they're set up as a solopreneur, like a LLC or, whatever it is, wherever you are, but you're running a business by yourself. And so you've become a business owner that doesn't want to do the business of running the business or don't even realize that you're doing it sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think it's tied to two things. One, I mean, you can't be good at everything. And even though you know about things, because in corporate you deal with accounting, you deal with finance, you deal with legal, and so you've got some ideas. But what you
Mm,
forget is that you had the ability and the luxury to just not worry about that stuff. Because if something came up, you could pick up a phone and say, hey, so and so, this thing's come up, and I realize it's probably a legal issue. And, I know I probably should have spoken to you last week, but anyway, and they can help you. So they can rescue you from wherever you are, even if in an ideal world you've done something. When you're running a business on your own and then you realize I'm already running the business and now, whoops, it turns out I should have had insurance. That matters because for a period of time, it's not just, okay, look, we can probably fix this. No, you have some fundamental issues. And so knowing or starting to learn about what you don't know, but also that you've got to get out of that mode of just having that feeling and knowledge that there's someone down the corridor that can help you. It's obvious when you say it. So it's not an intellectual challenge, but it's a behavioral challenge to try and get that behavior so that you start doing things in an anticipatory way. And I don't recall if when we spoke earlier I made this point, but for me, I sort of got going with gusto and I was like, hey, I'm off and running. And I was actually at a short conference in the October. This was 10 months later after leaving work back in Singapore. And this one gentleman did a presentation on, and this was for people who are trying to start again, do a second life, some kind of reinvention of themselves.
yeah.
And he said, look, the central thing, and he had come as from a head of finance, head of admin for big companies. His wife ran a
Mm,
small coaching enterprise and he provided all the back office. And he said, the thing you have to do is to make sure that you're set up as if you're a big business. So go and speak to people who can tell you what are the elements, because he said risk, insurance, liability, and then systems. If you can get those sorted out, the doing part is probably the thing you're going to struggle with the least, but it'll also mean you
Yeah.
can do that with a clear conscience and just do it. And when he said it, I just thought, wow, okay, I've been doing none of those things. It wasn't that I'd been doing some, I'd been doing none. And I thought, whoa. And I remember stopping everything, taking a break for 3 months and really calibrating, reorganizing everything I did. And yeah, when I
Mm.
restarted in January of last year, it was with a much
Mm.
sort of more relaxed part, saying, okay, I had an accounting system now and I had insurance and I had written in certain clauses into my contracts. And I even had contracts, which I hadn't before. I just sort of had one-to-one agreements with individuals. And he made the point very strongly
Yeah.
about the fact that he said, remember, you're contracting with companies. It's not that they are malicious towards you, but they have a way of working. And if something doesn't work, they will take the actions that they would against any vendor. But it just so happens he has a multi-billion company and you're a couple of 100,000 individual. And he said, that's going to be a losing battle from day one. So best you have all your protections written in. Just the lack. So that's why I say I think the thing that struck me was that it's intellectually you know this stuff, but it's that you don't have that
Yeah.
awareness that it forms such a fundamental part of the fabric of a business. Because for most of us, we have not previously set up businesses. And even if we started business divisions, as I have, that was with a whole
Mm.
army of experts who came along and did their little bit. And you looked at it and you were
Yeah.
aware of it and you might have even had an understanding of it, but you never internalized the fact that somebody had to go see all the issues and then find solutions for each and every one of the issues. You just knew it was happening and you thought,
Yeah.
that's great. And off we go. So, yeah, that the absence of structure, but the fact that and the longer you spent in corporate, the more that just formed a basic part of your life. It was just there, it just happened, and it was natural. Yeah, and I think the other thing that you do often, and it probably is really prevalent in coaches, you approach life from the wish to do good for and with other people. And therefore, you do a lot
Mm.
of stuff on a good faith basis. But that's not a good
Hmm.
basis for business. You can still have good faith, but it should be grounded in some well structured rules and systems.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to kind of go over the concept of the lifequake and how for you as a coach, you transitioned from your 40-year corporate career. How did you leverage your background, your stories as a way to kind of build your brand and build your business? And how do you think others can kind of model their transition similarly?
I think I did a course that is run by an organization called the Modern Elder Academy in the US. Was running it for slightly different reasons, but it's actually been embedded with and has been taken up by a coaching organization to make it into a structured program called TQ or Transitional Quotient, like EQ or IQ. The premise is that there are better ways to handle transitions and it can be learned and improved on, and therefore we can improve
Hmm.
your so-called transitional intelligence. And so this then became a course,
Yeah.
a proper program, and I have that qualification. So to answer your question, in fact, it was a little bit in reverse. I'd been going through this and then I was on this course and then I thought, aha, now I can see what's going on. And it's underpinned. So William Bridges is the sort of the godfather of transitions work. And he speaks of, the ending. So something ends, there's a new beginning. And
Hmm.
between that, he talks of the neutral zone. This course and a guy by the name of Bruce Feiler, who's done a lot more work more recently on transitions. He writes a book called Life
Hmm.
is in the Transitions, and he's got some great YouTube
Hmm.
videos. He speaks of an ending and then a new beginning, and in between
Hmm.
is the messy middle. I really like that.
Yeah.
And his premise is, and what his research found is that as adults, we go through these smaller transitions and let's call them changes about every 18 months. So we learn, we develop, we grow, and that's sort of natural process. But that every now and then a couple of these things coalesce or happen at the same time, and then you have what's called a
Hmm.
lifequake. So I was going through a change. I'm now moving into my 60s. I'm starting to contemplate retirement. My children are leaving home. We're coming for me with the end of working life is I'm having to think about a change of country. And then all of a sudden it all comes together and it's happening this year and you're on your way. So then you arguably meet the standards of a lifequake. The point about it is, and it's about how then do you manage that transition? And one of the things that's ironically key is to first establish at which point in this transition are you? Because
Hmm.
once you can identify that you really still are dealing with something ending, and you haven't adequately dealt with that. And that was part of my problem. I almost had to go back and say, look, let me really put a bow around this corporate life. Then you do what
Hmm.
your question was asking, which is you start saying, okay, but what can I take from this? What are actually the lessons that I've learned from this? and what becomes useful to carry forward. And then in that messy middle, they talk of, the best analogy I've heard is that it's like you're standing in a forest in the mist and you're trying to figure out which way to go. Naturally, you would say, can I see any light source anywhere? And they talk of that as glimmers, and glimmers are the opposite of triggers. And so you're trying to see what draws you, where's something that draws you towards that. And then you need to ask yourself, well, okay, what is this something that I can do something with? Is it positive for me? Do I find it attracting me? What basis do I have to do that? Which comes back to the, okay, so what lessons do you bring with you from corporate life? And for me, the sort of standout thing was that, in fact, managing and helping people to manage transitions is, in fact, a real skill set that I have. Because when I went back over my career, I thought 14 moves. So we went to 7 or 8 different countries, but we went to some of them twice. Changed industries, changed jobs, changed many things. You think, okay, so I think you might have learned something about how to handle these change things, but now with a bit of formal structure around how could you prosecute that with somebody, like some tools, techniques. So that's what all of that was. And it's obviously, I've seen this when I've coached people, that when you can recognize with them that they are in and are going through a lifequake, it really resonates with people because they just think, wow, so there's actually even a name for this. I mean, yes, I just thought my whole life was exploding into pieces, but it turns out I'm going through a natural sequence of change that is happening, and it is possible to move through this. And I think that's where you need to get things grounded again. So for me, it was, as I say, it was a thing I actually needed to go back and sort of use the coursework to go through with myself and clarify where was I, get myself moved well into the messy middle, sort out the direction. And it's been iterative, to be honest. I haven't quite clarified. So I find even now I'm sort of moving a little bit in terms of what do I define as my area where I specialize in coaching. Even that's moved as I do the work. Yeah, something new begins. But these lines are not absolute. But at some point, you need to leave one part behind, but you need to recognize that you're sort of moving out of something, and then you need to say, right, this thing has ended. And then at some point, you get enough clarity that most of your life moves out of the messy middle. But there will be elements which could still be there. But I just love the description because I think it's so apt. When I speak to coaches about this, you can see them looking, thinking, yes, that's what I'm going through. So it's great.
I feel like at the moment, the whole world is just figuring out that messy middle. I mean, again, with AI and just the state of the world, there's a lot of things in flux.
Absolutely. And that's why it's such a good framework, because it says, yeah, if you apply it on a macro scale, you're absolutely right, David. I mean, if you said, let's do this on a macro scale. So the world used to operate in the pre-AI mode. That is coming to an end. There's going to be a thing called the post or the AI world, but we're not there yet, but it's coming. And we can see elements of it appearing. And we're staying in the middle. And the glimmers are, we see a positive way of using AI and think, oh, hang on. So some of the medical research where AI is helping to get very high percentage rates on finding of tumors or assessing X-ray scans or whatever, you think, okay, that sounds good. I mean, that surely we'd all like that to happen. Oh, okay, that's good. So that's the glimmer, and that's something that can draw you towards it. But as we say, glimmers are the opposite of triggers. Simultaneously in that world, there are triggers that AI is going to get rid of all jobs. Oh, okay, I don't like the sound of that one too much. So that's what we're all dealing with. Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm curious for yourself, because as we're talking about just transitions, and obviously transition, we're always transitioning. And I'm curious for you, what have you learned about yourself as Bill Bryant, post-corporate, now coach? What have you learned about yourself in this transitionary time?
So I was very positively surprised that I didn't have that sort of need to identify with my corporate identity, because I had suspected that might be a problem because it was, so defining of everything you do for so long. But that didn't affect me. But the thing that surprised me was this inability to just naturally deal with the change of structure and to form new systems, ways of working that become positive and actually help you to do work. I was quite surprised at how resistant to change I had become and how much time I sort of spent circulating on myself. And the way I've learned I dealt with that was how people that have done, let's call them A-type personalities, that have dealt with in the past, you become more busy. And then you get really busy and you keep getting more busy because you think that'll eventually I'll solve the problem by just being busy all the time. And then there was a great retirement coach up in Sydney who had a quick chat with me and he said, listen, I have a saying called BINAM, and he says, busy is not always meaningful. That's the thing that's been bothering me because I didn't sort of articulate it, or I couldn't articulate it. But I'd get to the end of the week, I'd been super busy. I could tell you 1,000 things I'd done that week. But if you ask me, am I happy? I would tell you no. I'm feeling almost more unhappy because now I'm feeling like I'm busy, but I'm actually getting more detached from everything. So that's the thing I learned
Mm.
about myself. And it's sort of an ironic reminder that I needed to take myself back to the coursework that I was doing and helping that I was going to help everybody else do their transition. Say, well, how about you look at yourself and try and take yourself through the process? So it became very
Mm.
useful for me to try to ground myself, re-anchor myself, and slowing down to make
Mm.
progress was definitely a feature of what it was. And so, yeah, I think those things were the main things that I learned. And as I build some structure, I'm finding with each week, as I get the structure more better organized, it gets better. But
Yeah.
I'm not yet forming as well as I would like to in an ideal world, especially on the business
Mm.
development side. I'm feeling still something is holding me back, and I haven't quite figured out what that is, but I
Mm.
continue to work on that. So it's that
Mm.
transition to, because I think the thing coaches often wrestle with is that in your head, you believe you're selling yourself. But the thing you have to keep reminding yourself is that you are selling the service that you offer, not yourself. How do you articulate that? Because you get stuck and say, I don't want to sort of stand there and make as if I'm some kind of guru on something. And you think, well, no, you're not saying that. This is your thoughts about
Yeah.
something. That conflict
Yeah.
within oneself, I find, yeah, that I have wrestled with a lot.
And I find that a lot of coaches do have this struggle of separating themselves, their identity from the services that they deliver, and then the mindset when it comes to doing the business development or the consideration of marketing and sales.
Yeah.
Because often it feels like this icky thing. Like
And for
every
me,
coach I've talked to.
yeah, for me, it's much more in the latter category. When I do the coaching, that feels comfortable, it feels logical, it feels natural. And I feel that my
Yeah.
experience and everything I bring to the table has a net positive value. Oftentimes,
Mhm.
things will come up and people think they've got a unique situation. You think, well, I've kind of seen a variation of that somewhere in my life. And by
Yeah.
having had the benefit of having worked in many different cultural environments, helps a lot there too. But this
Yeah.
theme of sell yourself versus sell the service, that for sure is a daily struggle. And I think that's the thing, if I'm honest, that's ultimately holding me back from really sort of going full ball on the business
Mm.
development, because it's sort of that you want to do it and then you think, oh, not liking the feeling of this. And then so you're in that tension all the time.
Yeah. So let me share with you something that's really helped me. So what has helped me is to think about it in a different perspective when it comes to doing the marketing and sales. Because I had the same problem of I don't want to do sales. I don't want to be one of these, sales guys. They're almost all charlatans, I feel like, right? And that's not who I am. So I've really distanced myself from trying to go there. But I repositioned the whole conversation. So Bill, do you feel like you're an ethical and moral person?
Yes,
What would you do?
I would certainly help them to the extent I could. Yeah.
Yeah. They don't know you're a doctor though. And so as you approach them, they're just like, get away from me. So what would you do in that situation?
You would try and inform them what you bring to the table. And look, I've got skill sets that can be helpful in this example.
So you tell them you're qualified as a doctor, right? You
Right.
tell them your mission, you can actually heal them and help them. Now, there are people in this world, and as a coach, do you feel like the work that you've done with your clients has been helpful to them in a real way?
Definitely. I'm seeing the change, and they are, more importantly, they're seeing the change.
Now, do you think more people in the world would benefit from working with you?
Definitely. The right people that are ready for coaching, certainly.
Right. The problem is that they don't know who you are. And so, as a moral and ethical obligation, you should tell people who you are, what you do, and how you can help them because they're hurting. They need help. They just don't know what coaching is about and who can help them.
I like this framework. It's actually a very useful framework when you put it in those reference points that are, easy, because that example, and we say, well, it's an easy example, but you actually have connected the dots very nicely there. So yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And for me personally, when it comes to talking about the services or the work that I do, it's thinking of it from this perspective because I do know that what I do can help somebody. They just don't know me. So now it's not like I'm just trying to sell. I approach it from this of what I do will help you. You just don't know it. let me try to educate as many people as possible about what it is that I do and how I help, so that the people who are willing to accept that help, because not everybody's going to accept the help on the side of the road, even though they're hurt, because they're, for whatever reason, obstinate, because maybe they're just like, I'm not really hurt. It's not that bad. Or I don't trust you for whatever reason. That's fine. Like, you want to help them, you offer. If they don't accept it, then that's unfortunate for them.
And it,
But the people who receive and hear it will, and those are the people that you can help, right?
absolutely. And it tallies with this research, as I say, that I've seen more and more of, that probably the biggest indicator for success of coaching will be the readiness of the coachee to be coached. Because where you see that the organization has decided that you shall be coached, the person thinks, well, I don't need to be coached. That's usually where the coach struggles like hell to try and get this person kind of moving in the right direction, because they feel like, look, I don't need this. My boss thinks I need this, but he doesn't know anything. That's part of the problem. And so you're absolutely
Yeah.
right that it's a good analogy, because it deals with the part of, even if I say something, not everybody will like it or not everybody will accept it. And that's okay, because they aren't the
Yeah.
ones that necessarily need to hear the message, but you should still portray the message, because the message will be heard by those that are ready and able to utilize it. So no, I like it. It's very nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been helpful for me, and it's probably going to become one of the biggest points that I keep pushing on for coaches, because it is such a mental hurdle to overcome when it comes to the whole business development side of things. Because every coach I've talked to says, I don't like marketing. It feels icky. It feels unauthentic. I don't want to be one of those guys in your email box.
And I think that the connection between that and sort of the business course that I'm on is, and I haven't fully taken that on board, but I really like what you've described. I think that's a really helpful reframe of the mindset. Then one can go back and say, okay, but you still need tools, because now it's Monday morning, and what are you actually going to do? And you have to have some kind of a
Yeah.
battle plan and an organizational plan. And so those are helpful. They also by themselves are not enough. Because if every time, and that's what's
Yeah.
been happening to me, you open them up and you think, yeah, but the problem is that I'm going to be this guy that is like the sleazy guy in the guy's inbox, and I don't want to do that, even if the tool's very good. So this is, you've got to solve the mental approach and then supplement it with some good structures and tools that help you to do the physical work that's going to be required at the end of the day.
Yeah. So the mental approach is probably one of the hardest. The tools and the structure to get it done, there's enough information out there, ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, give you an idea or a plan, but you want to do your research first and then feed that into the system, because you want to find the system and process that actually connects with who you are, because there's 100 different variations of what you want to do, but you got to find the one that works for you.
Absolutely. And
Um,
I think the one connection that you've just triggered, David, is that when you find that sort of authentic voice, actually it becomes very easy then to do the message. Because I did a trial fairly recently where I was sort of struggling. One of the suggestions was, look, just write about the fact that you are struggling with this concept. And it was very interesting,
mm,
the feedback that I got on that post, because a lot of people said, wow, okay, this sounds really authentic. This sounds genuine. This is a real thing. And I thought, huh. So nobody said, look, you're an idiot and please move on. They all said, look, we get you. That's real. That one person even said, it's so much more refreshing to hear an authentic message, even if it's a message of, if you like, quote unquote, struggle, than these glossed over, shiny looking statements
yeah.
that come out in many cases, but have no authenticity. So I think that your use of the word authentic is really important in that, because if you can find out what that is, and this post,
Yeah.
which was just a month or so ago, has been the trigger that's sort of starting to move me back into the direction of saying, all right, I'm ready to sort of now tackle this with a bit more vigor. But you've really added an
Mhm.
important piece of the framework today, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Unfortunately, we have to bring this to a close. But before I close, I'd like to ask you with one more question, which is, what's one piece of advice that you'd give someone who's just beginning their coaching journey?
I would say develop and enhance all the networks you have. If you've already got networks,
Hmm.
you've already got connections, develop and enhance. Start advising people, I'm moving into coaching. I'd love to stay in contact. If you have the need, and that would be especially important where you've got networks of people who play a role in the decision making around who might go to coaching. Because I think if you've got those people,
Mm,
safe, connected, friendly people to reach out to, wow, that takes you
yeah,
far, far ahead of the game in terms of helping along that transition. Whilst you sort everything out, you've got the ability to reach out,
yeah.
to connect to, and maybe even get a few things going as you get your systems and
Hmm.
everything else up into shape. Because it's going to be a process. You can't wait until everything's perfect and you've got this amazing organization set up, and then I'll journey. And it's especially relevant to people who are either in corporate thinking to move out, have started to do the development work. My message to them would be,
Yeah.
whatever you do, this is your time. Grab your network, enhance it, protect it, make sure that you've got all of that very robust, and stay focused on that as you move into the new space. Don't let the setting up of the business become the only thing you focus on.
Yeah.
I would add to that just
Bill,
the 1.1/B point is make sure you get some of the critical systems set up before you go launching out into business, because that was a big learning for me.
Bill, thank you so much for your time today. If anyone wanted to get connected with you, how can they do that?
Thank you for that, David, and thanks for the session today. So I'm available at bill@billbryant.com.au, and that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. And not too long from now, I'm just going through some of the finalization. I'll have a website that's linked to that, but the billbryant.com.au will be the website eventually. But for the moment, just stick to the email, and that'll be the best way to get a hold of me straight off the bat.
Okay, wonderful. Bill, thank you again so much for your time today, and we'll see you guys all next time.
Thanks, David. Wonderful chatting to you again. So have a good day. Thank you.
Want to stop guessing and start building a marketing system that actually fills your calendar? Head to kyber5.com/coachops and let's get systematic. That's it for today's episode. I hope you grabbed something useful you can actually apply in your business. If you did, leave a comment or share it with a friend. And hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'll catch you next week.